The leader track on the album, the first track, is Agnes the Giant Killer, which is, there's a local tale, not far from where I live, about 5 miles I think, it's St Agnes Chapel Porth area, of a giant bolster, who was supposed to be this giant character that stood on top of St Agnes Beacon, with 1 foot on St Agnes Beacon and 1 foot on Calm Bray, which is about a distance of 6 miles. So, but local historians think, and historians generally think, that these tales of giants and are the or the Saxons that moved down here and sort of took over little areas of Cornwall, because they were big chaps compared to the locals. And the story is that basically he, either a giant or a chieftain, fell in love with a local girl called Agnes, and she didn't really like him. He was a bit clumsy. He was a bit of an oaf. So she tricked him one day and said, "Look, if you do this one thing for me, I'll marry you." And he was like, "Anything you want, anything you want." She said, "If you fill that little hole, there's a little indentation in the cliff at Chapel Porth. If you fill that little hole with your blood, right up to the top, I'll marry you." And he looked at the hole, and there's a little tiny little dent, and he went, "That sounds, I can do that, no problem at all. I've got plenty of blood." So he lay on the rock, and he got his knife, and he cut himself, and bled into the rock. And unbeknownst to him, the rock was bottomless, and it went straight down into the sea. So he just lay there and basically bled to death. And and there's actually a red staining on the cliff edge at Chapel Porth, and this is what the tale's all about. And I got to thinking about that, and she was heralded as a saint. You know, Saint Agnes has saved the day and got rid of the boss. But then it could just all be propaganda, couldn't it? Cornish propaganda. And at the end of the day, she sort of beguiled this. It was, by all accounts, he was quite a simple character. She beguiled him into slitting his own wrist and bleeding to death into this. I'm sure there's other ways of turning someone down, but so yeah. So I wrote this song on looking at life from his point of view, because they have a big bolster day in St Agnes, where they make this great big papier-mâché bolster, and he sort of lollops up the cliff, and they reenact the whole thing, and they have a nice little song, and it's all very sweet and all lovely. So I just thought I'd turn that whole scenario on its head, and have it from the bolster's point of view, because he's back in the day, there was people sort of wandering around the planet, and he was just ended up in Cornwall, and he was tricked into death for the love of a lady. I thought it was quite tragic. So yeah, so that's St Agnes the Giant Killer. So I just thought I'd turn it all on its head. The second track, Sarah, the Devil and Jack, I believe. While I was doing my research for this album, I came across this story of Sarah Paul Green, who was actually hung at Bodmin Jail in 1821, I think, for murdering her husband. With a bit more investigation, I found out there's a story behind that as well, because her husband was a bit of a rogue tyrant apparently, and didn't treat her very nice, and she fell in love with her neighbour, who was this character called Yorkshire Jack, who was a horse dealer, and he was from Yorkshire, but he'd moved down to Cornwall. He was trading in horses, and yeah, they fell in love. It wasn't that easy in those days just to get a simple divorce and all the rest of it, so they plotted to poison her husband. So they did. She was caught. He never owned up to it. She never grassed him up. And 3 days later, she was hanging from the gallows. Now, he followed her up the gallows, hand in hand, and it said that just before they let her drop, he pronounced that he'd marry her. He said, "I'll marry you." And she said, "I'll marry you too." And then they hung her. The story goes even further that she then proceeded to haunt him, going, "You promised to marry me," and drove him a little bit mad. He got quite depressed. He had to move out the area. He started working on the ships, and they were coming back one day, back to Mounts Bay, the area by Penzance. And this big storm kicked up, and the rest of the shipmates saw Jack, Yorkshire Jack, and he was saying, she's here, and wandering up and down the ship. And then he just threw himself over the side. Now some people say they saw Sarah Paul Green riding storm clouds with the devil, and she came down, picked him up and took him off. I thought that was quite an interesting story as well, so I thought that'll make a nice little love tale. So that's the Sarah, the Devil and Jack tale. So yeah, that's the first 2 tracks.